Good. So for those that don't know, I'm Marc Smith, the Editor of European Communications. We're a B2B telecoms title focused exclusively on the European telco sector. So delighted to sit down with Rich, and I don't know what he's done to be the only man to warrant a journalist at quizzing him this morning, but...
I'm nervous.
He's nervous. Don't be nervous. Let's start with those four scenarios, Rich, that IDATE have proposed this morning. What are your thoughts on those? I mean, are they ones that you kind of can envisage happening? And could you envisage Verizon fitting into one of those in particular? What are your thoughts overall on those?
Yeah, no, I think so. And it's obviously a very interesting view of as we're looking and peering into looking at the future down 2020, 2025. And, it was interesting, a lot of the discussions that were happening today across all of that, and, the open sharing, economy, and I think those are important to us. When we look at it, in Verizon, we're looking at actually a three-tier model here. The ones across connectivity, the other ones across platform. And then, of course, the solutions that come across all of that. So I think, certainly what resonates is certainly the top two there around the wall and the OpenStack. Those definitely. But the whole idea is that you've got to understand what your core competencies are across all of this. And when you take a look at Verizon and who we are and where we've kind of risen from, clearly it's, network has been, an incredibly important part of what we are and who we are. We've made massive investments. If you take a look at the last 10 years, averaging about 17 billion, investments, right across building, the networks both in the US and obviously globally, but, around 4G really driving that mobility business. But the question now is that you've got all of these different businesses. You've got in the consumer, you've got the mobility piece, you've got the broadband piece of it, and of course we've still got the telco business. We've got cloud asset security. So you look at them all individually here, but the question now is that how do you really grab all of these assets and really integrate and fuse them together? Because when you do that, that's where you start to create these platforms. And for us, the most important part of it is the OpenStack sharing platform there, because you've got to invite your partners where they have their core assets. So the way we look at it, they've got their core assets, we've got our core assets. How do you leverage those in the best way? Because at the end of the day, we got to go and figure out how we deliver solutions to the customers. And that's where the complexity is coming from. So there was a lot of discussion there, and we totally agree. I mean, it's got to be, an open platform. You've got to invite partners so you can leverage all of those assets, and that's a very important part of it.
Okay. So you talk about partners, but of course the mouse scenario that IDATE put forward is kind of predicated to a certain extent on some serious M&A activity happening. Verizon really kind of got into that last year with the acquisition of AOL, and that really sort of fits into that whole sort of mole scenario. Just maybe remind us really sort of the thinking behind why you guys acquired AOL.
Sure. So, let's just kind of come back and give this part of it the context, and that is around the connectivity piece of it. Look at that through, and that's critically important. If you take a look at our wireless business in the US, it's now grown to 107 million subscribers. Very, very important. But then it comes back to the conversation across this platform that we're building, and we're building multiple platforms across all of that. And the key component of that is what those platforms do. They enable the distribution of content, as well as obviously enabling participation in the ecosystem. But on the enablement of the distribution of content, if you take a look at that asset of AOL, very rich in content. But they've also got a very interesting advertising platform, which we know about. So you've got 107 million mobile subscribers. You've got connectivity, that we've built out with the 4G, and certainly our investments, and now we're getting very much ahead on the 5G technology. So you start to combine those, and those are the investments that we're making. So we look at it in a couple of ways. Is how do we become a much more interesting player across that distribution of content, and that plays well. And then obviously you take a look at looking at new revenue streams, and of course across that advertising, and Sven would know this, is that this is a $600 billion business, so how do we get a piece of that in a more meaningful way? So it's leveraging our assets to do that, and that's where the partnership really comes in. That's where we see that, and it's been successful. If you take a look at the last quarter, they've had the best quarter in the last 5 years. So look, early signs are it's working.
Yeah. Well, I should probably declare a conflict of interest, and I still have an AOL email address as my primary personal email address. But tell us something. You said it's been sort of 12 months now, really, since that deal was announced, pretty much. So can you give us some sort of concrete examples of what has happened? What some of the actually sort of things that have come out of the partnership? Of the acquisition?
Yeah. So the first part of it is that they are run completely separately, the businesses there, and I think for good reason that we incubate that. We want to make sure that piece of the business really starts it continues to drive the success that it has been. Because if you look at it over the past 5 years, Tim Armstrong's done an unbelievable job of driving a very successful business. We don't want to stop that. You got to keep that momentum, and that's very, very important. But what we're starting to do is start to introduce, how do we leverage those? How do we leverage some of those assets? And we're doing some things across Go90, which is an application that we've now driven out of the US, which is all about video across mobility. So that's quite an interesting play. There may well be some really interesting plays across the enterprise market as well. We're having conversations with some of the folks here. Because the interesting thing is that they have the same customer base as we have. So how do we leverage that? They go off and they talk to we talk to the CIOs, they talk to CMOs, and we're starting to see some very interesting overlaps there that we can start to bring together. So, watch out. So, but I think the key point is that we've got to make sure they maintain the momentum, but start leveraging the assets that we have.
Okay, we'll come and talk about the enterprise side in a bit, but obviously not everyone can buy an AOL. But nevertheless, what would you say to your sort of peers in Europe who are maybe looking into that sort of mall space? Should they be looking to acquire digital businesses such as AOL?
It all depends. Look, what I would say to them, again, I go back to understanding what your core competency is. And you've got to really have a very firm idea about what that is. And if you think that there is an adjacent asset or an adjacent technology that you can absolutely leverage, then yes, I'll start to see that. And we're starting to see, some areas of, it was interesting reading about HP and CSS recently. Their core competency about the services business, bringing those together. So you start to see, some consolidation across that. But, I'll come back to it and say, understand your core business. What can you leverage?
Okay. M&A consolidation is a really hot topic in Europe. Obviously, the big news recently was the Commission blocking the O2 and 3 deal here in the UK. What are your thoughts on what really needs to happen in Europe? How far does it still have to go and need to go on that consolidation front? And if that's kind of like your thoughts, your wish, what in reality do you think will happen as well?
Across regulation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a very interesting space across all of that, right? And the way that we look at it, and we take a big steer from, kind of like what's happened in the US. And I've got my esteemed colleague, Tom Daly, to keep me honest across all of this. But in the regulation, it's important that our view is a couple of, it's got to be harmonious, it's got to be simple, it's got to be predictable. Low touch regulation, as well as creating a framework that really empowers the consumer. So when you look at regulation, when we say harmonious, simple, we look at what's going on across there. The EU have got a very interesting agenda across the single digital market. So we believe that that's a good thing, right? So we support that. But that's a very interesting subject too. We think that that's a good idea because therefore, right across all of the different geographies, that you start to get consistent regulation. Now, why is all of this so important? And that is because if we're going to make significant investments, and we've seen it in the US, where there's a light regulatory market, it's allowed for very significant investment into, particularly around infrastructure, broadband. And as a result of that, you start to see a lot of, like with the GAFAs, if you take a look at what, it's enabled and created incredible demand. I mean, the GAFAs are incredibly good around an operating system and integrating software and creating the demand across all of that. And as a result of that, we continue to invest in the internet, and you can't stop that. And that's the important part about regulation. So that's why it needs to be harmonious. The other thing too, which is an interesting one, is that there's a horizontal element to it across all of that. And what we look at is to ensure and encourage that, particularly with the GAFAs, is that deliver a consistent service right across all of the different countries as well. So again, it's predictable as well as simplified. And then it's just about empowering the consumer. Keep it open, and that means you've got to create frameworks to do that, to allow the consumer to really be able to be having the vote as to where are the services, how they consume it, and really kind of drive that demand.
But overall, you're happy with the direction of travel in Europe in regulatory terms?
Well, I think there's certainly work to be done across that. Yes, there is. Because I gave you an example about the EU single digital market, but there's apps, because at a regional level, it isn't harmonious, and I think that across that, that the EU definitely needs to get across that and go figure out how it brings it together. All 28 countries, it is not harmonious, and that's where it's got to come together.
And it's very difficult. Are you confident that will happen down the line?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's, I'm being kind.
Keep prodding.
I know, keep going. Look, we've been some very interesting discussions across all of this, but, if you're in France and Germany versus the UK and other places, they've got different views about data privacy, etc. And they're going to push it hard because they're going to protect either their industry, their companies, and our view is it should be as open as possible.
We won't go down the Brexit route. We'll draw back from that.
I agree with Luis's view. Let's stay.
Let's move on to the enterprise, which is your kind of real area of focus. We've seen this morning about how consumers are kind of moving away from the traditional telco services. Enterprises, to a certain extent, are doing exactly the same as well. I'm kind of very interested in sort of hearing from you why telcos can be the go-to provider for businesses looking for these sort of non-traditional services. So again, we talk about cloud, security, was mentioned this morning. Why can telcos play in that space and be successful?
Yeah. So come back to that three-tier model that we talk about: connectivity, platform, all delivering solutions, right? So, we've got a very strong view is that around connectivity, because that is, arguably the enabler of the digital economy. Okay, so if you take a look at it, with Google wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the internet in the first place. Google, 17, 18 years, right? Well, the internet was there, but it was in such a nascent place at that time. But they grew up from that. So if the starting point is connectivity around all of that, and the massive investments that we've made to go in there to be able to support that demand that's out there, that's a good starting place, so that we believe. And then once you understand that, then you got to go figure out what your assets are. So now I put myself, in the customer's shoe, and I'm saying, okay, I understand that, because I want to ensure that all my applications are delivered in the safest, most secure, and seamless way possible. That's what they care about. Because solutions, at the end of the day, what's it all about? It's about business outcomes. Now, that's a big word, because, and we all try to get to that point of, business outcomes and be able to write contracts across all of that. But it's a lot more difficult than said than done. But that's ultimately where we're trying to get to. But you come from the starting point of connectivity, building platforms that deliver solutions or business outcomes. And that's why we think we have it right. The other thing too across all of that, there are some very important adjacent technologies across all of that. And one of them is security. So if you think about that, and we're delivering, across the, if you look at the IP traffic across global network, we deliver a very significant portion of that. Now that gives us a very unique ability to take a look at all of the threats and vulnerabilities that go across all of that. And that allows us, to develop what we call the DBIR, the Data Breach Intelligence Report, and it's an open report that for the, to the public, but it just allows and gives the public, a visibility into all that. But the point being is that without the internet, without that connectivity, which is the platform of where we build our business, security is absolutely a very tight adjacent technology to that. That drives our right to be able to be in that space.
Yeah. What do you think? I totally understand why you and all the other telcos are looking at security, and it's obviously a big space. Is it not the case still, though, that the biggest security threat comes from employees themselves?
That's an interesting one, because if you look at the Data Breach Intelligence Report, it's a very important one, but it isn't the most important one. If you take a look at it, there's 9 patents there's across all of that. It still comes around point of sale and crimeware. That represents, and then if you take a look at the motives across all of that, it's around financial, and then it's around it's around espionage. And that represents something, in the range of about 83% of all the security breaches out there. So while that's probably the most obvious one, it's not necessarily where most of the attacks are coming from.
Okay. Let's talk about cloud for a minute. Luis has talked about what BT are doing there. I'm quite interested, there's a few telcos, Deutsche Telekom is one that's really trying to get into the public cloud space and take on the Amazons and the Googles of this world.
Yeah.
What do you think about that whole play? Is that an achievable goal to get a slice of that market?
It's a tough one, on the public, to go after that, because I think that you've got the Amazons and you've got Azure that have now claimed a very, very dominant place in the public cloud market. And they can do that because they can do it at scale. They can really drive an interesting value proposition, for customers. So, are they too late in the market? We'll see. But my sense is that I think you've got the 2 leading companies in that marketplace that'll continue to drive that. It'll be a tough road to hoe.
Okay. You guys do a lot. So we've talked about mobility, we've talked about security, we've talked about cloud. There's a few other bits as well. When you look at your business, what are the sort of the real key challenges that you face in succeeding in those areas?
Yeah. Well, also, so the other, is this whole concept of virtualization. Now we're talking about the network virtualization brings this whole subject about SDN. It's a big buzzword out there, but it's real. And we're investing very, very significantly across all of that. It's a different way that we have different conversations now with our customers. Instead of looking at the physical assets of the network, we now start to talk to them in terms of from the applications and how I can deliver that in a much, much more efficient way. About how to configure networks, again, in a much more intelligent way. And we're well on the road, across all of that with services. The challenge there, and then you got the intelligence, the kernel of intelligence there is around NFV, that's network functions, the virtualization. And that's the part where we invite the partners. That's where the real ecosystem and the value comes. So, and it was interesting because Gary and I had this conversation as we were coming in here. And the real challenge then is that in this whole ecosystem, how does all of that now come together? in a very efficient way to deliver that solution back to the customer. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done around that. But there's great opportunity across all of that. It's clearly we're very, very focused. But at the same time, it's going to be interesting to see how that space works, just in terms of that ecosystem, pulling all of the different players together. I've mentioned regulatory. I think that that's a big challenge that we're going to have to really come across. And the other one, I think, is around culture too. This is the other really important part. You take a look at our companies here that we have. We're a bunch of baby boomers here that are in these companies. Now, you look at Google, they grew up, they got a whole bunch of millennials in their company. So there's no good or bad, but it's getting that right balance there, because you got to have that right balance there from the people that, have got scars on their back. We've seen, a lot of things in the past, but geez, you need the bright minds, the creative minds to unleash there in the marketplace. It drives the innovation.
And to get over that, is that where you sort of you rely on partners to have those millennials, or are you trying to hire those millennials in-house as well?
Combination of both, because this whole strategy, to develop partners is very, very important, and we're working very hard to do that. But at the same time, yes, we're right here in. I've got a very concerted effort to bring in some youth, the millennials, into it to drive some innovation. So I think it's really just the right balance, combination of both. We're attacking it from both angles.
Yeah, and can you? How easy is it to sort of retrain these baby boomers and the guys with the scars on their back in new technologies? Is that a real part? Because there is an argument to say that digitization, by definition, means that there are going to be job losses, right?
Hey, look, it is a challenge, in doing that, because it is retraining. It's because people get into their comfort zone. Once you're in that kind of comfort zone, you're like, hey, you know what? I got 10 years or 15 years, and I can, see myself, reading that EDATE book on the beach, and so you got to kind of. There is a massive retraining, and look, I could talk to, I'm sure Luis and this company's doing, but geez, we're going through a massive retraining, program here to get people on board here.
That's a big job. Two more questions before we finish, Rich. Again, another sort of key topic which we talked about this morning is this idea of trust. If we're going to maybe focus on what you do on the enterprise side, telcos have talked about this for a long time, that they're the trusted partner and they like to think about trust.
Yeah.
Do you think really, ultimately, that telcos are more trusted than the digital players? And is that something you can still trade off?
Yeah, that's, the thing is, and I like what Luis said, is that you got to be really, really close to your customer. So the question at the end of the day is, who is close to the customer? Who has the mind share? Who really understands what's going on? And I really can't speak, towards, let's say, the GAFAs and where they are, in terms of all of that. But telcos, in many cases, that they've had a relationship, and the whole idea is to take these customers on a journey. So I like to look. I like to think is that once you get trust, you stick to it and you build it. You got to maintain it, because we always go through some ups and downs, but. There's always a starting point with customers. As long as you build that, take them on a journey, you'll be able to maintain that trust over the long term.
Okay. We started off today talking about the scenarios for 2025, so let's finish on that. How would you like Verizon to be viewed in 2025?
Yeah, so look, I know where our CEO looks at us, and he's like, we are going to be an enabler of the digital age, a technology company. We've got to shed the telco, move as rapidly as we can to a technology company. We're making some aggressive moves across all of that. But that's how I think that we all want Verizon to be viewed, as a true technology partner that enables and drives proper solutions that have business outcomes to their customers at the end of the day.
Good stuff. Rich, thank you very much.
Thank you.